You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Well, welcome back to On the Way Home, and whether it's morning, noon, or night where you are, welcome. Ontario has been extremely active in passing housing legislation in recent years, all with the goal of increasing housing supply and addressing affordability. But an important question remains. Have these policy changes actually helped deliver more below market housing? Today's conversation looks forward. If the next Ontario housing bill were written with the explicit goal of delivering below market housing at scale, what should be in it? To explore that question, I'm joined by three leaders working directly in housing development, finance, and sector strategy. First, John Fox. Welcome, John. John is a partner at Robins Appleby, where he leads the firm's affordable and social housing group. His practice focuses on real estate development and housing policy, advising municipalities, nonprofits, and private developers on the legal and financial structures needed to deliver affordable housing projects. Earlier in his career, John served as General Counsel and Vice President of Development at Toronto Community Housing, where he worked on major redevelopment initiatives, including Regent Park. Next, Nick Gefucia. Nick is Senior Vice President, Affordable Housing at EllisDon Community Builders, where he leads efforts to develop affordable housing projects across Canada. With a background spanning law, banking, and infrastructure finance, Nick focuses on structuring partnerships between governments, nonprofits, and the private sector to deliver housing at scale. And last but not least, Andrew McKenzie, who is Director of Operations at the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, the province's largest network representing community housing providers. Through his work at ONFA, Andrew supports sector strategy, partnerships, and operational initiatives that help nonprofit housing providers navigate development, financing, and policy challenges across Ontario. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
It's good to be here.
We'll start with some context. So Ontario has passed a number of housing bills over the past few years, aimed largely at increasing housing supply and speeding up development approvals. But from the perspective of community housing providers and nonprofit developers, the key question is, has it helped? So maybe we'll start by setting the context. John, I'm going to ask you to provide some opening context. With the bills that have been passed over the past few years, all aimed at building more homes faster, most of those policies were designed primarily with the private market in mind. From the perspective of community and nonprofit housing providers, have these changes helped deliver more below market housing? What's worked and what hasn't?
Well, given the timeframes of development, it's probably too early to say what has worked or to point to specific spots. But what I want to say is this: like, there's no faulting the government for legislative activism here. They're up to like 7 or 8 bills. I was actually listing them out in preparation for this, right back to 109 and 23, 97, 134, 17, 60, 98. It's like a bingo card, and I think that's a really positive thing, because what it means is that there's always another one, because there's always something else we can do to make this better. And so I want to start by just saying I think it's a positive thing to have that many bills, and they have actually changed course on a couple of things in the course of that. For example, Bill 109 started with a fairly complex development charge deferral system. Bill 23 replaced that with an exemption. That was a positive change, and something that the government was reacting to, and then just made a change. So I think that's a positive way of dealing with legislation in this kind of space. Secondly, the things in there which are of general application are helpful to the nonprofits as much as they're helpful to a for-profit developer. So, for example, there's a lot. You said building faster, and that's effectively the variation on the names of just about every single one of these bills. It's build faster, build smarter, and so on. And when they do things which reduce the speed with which we can bring a piece of land and turn it into doors and with keys and families living there, that's always positive across the board for development. In fact, when I've heard the development community speak, like when they talk about what's better to focus on, a reduction in in construction costs through modern methods of construction versus speed, they'll always say, give me speed above anything else. And so to the extent that we are reducing timeframes for delivery of housing, that's a really positive thing. Specifically to nonprofits, there has been fairly little in there which is aimed directly at nonprofits. So I alluded to the one thing before, which was a development charge exemption. So Bill 23 included an exemption which is related to the corporate structure of the developer. So if a developer is a nonprofit organization, it does not pay development charges. That is a significant advantage to a nonprofit pro forma going forward with a development. There has not been other kinds of, when you think about helping development in the nonprofit space, meaning money, because you in order to build and charge less rent, you need to make up for the fact you're not charging rent to pay for stuff. That you haven't seen a lot. So the matching grant for operations, which would come and march alongside capital funding from the federal government, for instance, we haven't seen a lot of that. So I will come back to the development charge exemption and how I think it's playing out when we talk about future legislation, but that's really the biggest piece in my mind that has directly impacted a nonprofit pro forma.
And so maybe we'll go to you, Nick. There's been a lot of legislative conversation that has centered on increasing overall supply with the assumption that affordability will follow. But in practice, why doesn't build more housing automatically translate into more nonprofit or below market housing? And what's missing from the policy framework today that could actually produce those homes?
I think, there's a lot in that question. I think that a lot of people presuppose that because we've had a lot of policy, both at the federal, provincial levels, aimed at increasing supply, that we have, and we haven't. And if we looked at the National Housing Strategy, we're at the tail end. That's been a $115 billion plus program. And I think we were at 200,000 new units created, 300,000 units preserved. So I don't think it's fair to assess that we've built an oversupply based on the policies. In fact, I think we're at a more severe deficit than we've ever been. But that said, there's a lot to be said about what has been built. And we have condo pre-sales have all but collapsed. The question now with Build Canada Homes and how the province is working concurrently with them is the focus on non-market housing. I believe the numbers is a commitment to build 45,000 non-market homes and 4,000 transitional immediately in their initial 3 to 5 years. So that I think the transition there looks at who is going to build those. There's been a lot of burden put onto nonprofits to build their own supply. And I think that we really have to reassess how we partner with both the province and the feds. The province and the feds need to work concurrently. There's a lot of focus on modern methods of construction, as John has alluded to, and where the province can really step in. We see a lot of technological innovation being spurred by the federal programs. Where I see the province playing a huge role is leveraging that technological innovation in its planning and approvals processes. We saw a little bit in Bill 185. We saw a little bit of in fighting delays in Building Faster Act. With the concepts of standardized designs, for example, having those vetted at the provincial level so we have expedited approvals. The type of building that goes into that will really facilitate nonprofits who are overexposed with risk and equity investments at the beginning of projects. If we can reduce that stage of pre-development into construction by leveraging the technological innovations that we have from the federal programs, I think that we are going to start seeing the right housing built a lot faster, a lot cheaper, and that would really provide a boost for non-market housing, not just with overall supply, but with targeted non-market housing for our communities.
So Andrew, maybe we'll go to you for a minute to talk about the system as it exists today and how you're experiencing it from your desk at ONFA. If a nonprofit developer wanted to build housing tomorrow, what parts of Ontario's current legislative or regulatory framework would still make that difficult? What are the biggest barriers?
Thanks, Emmy, and I hate to pick on the biggest thing, but I think we need a comprehensive review of the act in which we work under. So I think the HSA for a lot of community housing nonprofit providers is looking since its inception, or I won't say since its inception. I'll say since it's moving along in the continuum of time. When we think about the things that you need to build and develop and get into the game, as Nick and John outlined, there's just a fact of clear and consistent operation that's going to happen. And when you're writing out performers and you're writing out concepts on how you want to partner with folks, they're going to want to know how you can foot that bill, not over the first year, but over the first 10. And when you look at the HSA as a model, it hasn't moved with inflation. So if things aren't moving with inflation, and this is a system thing, because I think it's not just the HSA, it's a parallel with other social services. But if the way you take in money is artificially capped or is limited, you're never going to be in a position to effectively partner the way we want to, or to bring in those revenues in order to go out and develop. Now, it's not the case for everybody. We have some large providers in some regions that are part of our membership that are very fruitfully developing things. But I talk about the nonprofit community housing sector as a whole. I think we need a comprehensive review of the HSA and how has the HSA evolved with time, with inflation, and our service managers or our community housing providers charging the appropriate amounts of rent. The answer will probably be no, but if you're looking at it in a larger social context, you're probably not getting the right amount of support coming from certain social programs like OW and ODSP to contribute to higher rents that will also, bump up the chain. Because a lot of people in our spaces are doing, new development and bringing on buildings bringing online buildings that are mostly close to that for-profit, right? But the whole structure of what we do and the tenants that we take care of, the complexities, there's just not enough money in the system that's supporting how we operate as community housing providers for most of us to put a big foot into the development game.
Thank you. So if we take all of you to think about, if we imagined that the Ontario government is drafting its next housing bill, and this time the explicit objective is to deliver significantly more non-market, below market housing, what specific policies would you include? What bold change could fundamentally shift the trajectory of community housing in Ontario? And I'm going to open the floor to ask everyone to discuss this and debate it, and enjoy a good time, listeners.
Well, I'll jump in first then, because as you pointed out at the beginning, it was my idea, so I better not let any silence reign. So I would be looking at two distinct categories of changes to help move things along. If there were a silver bullet and that could work without adding just tons of money into the system, we'd already have done it. So nothing here is a silver bullet. It's whether or not you're building or removing barriers sufficiently to allow things to happen which might not otherwise have happened. So roughly speaking, the two main categories are reducing cost or reducing a nonprofit pro forma to allow the development to happen. And the second main category is more systemic changes to the way we can manage both the housing sector and affordability legislatively, which would help make us move forward. So I'll talk about the money one first and come back after these guys have had a chance to jump in to talk about the systemic ones. So there's an obvious thing you could do. You could say we're going to commit X millions of dollars into supportive housing. We're going to match BCH, and we're going to march side by side. That there's a whole. You don't need legislation for that. You need a budget allocation. So two things we could do, which would help with actual legislation, though. One of the types of deals we see, which is very attractive right now, where you have a developer who owns land and is kind of stuck with it. They want to approach a nonprofit and say, I'll sell you this land, but along with the land, you buy my building services, and I'll develop it for you and build it for you, and then we turn it over to you, and you get your fully, your building. Very positive thing. They're taking advantage of the fact that the nonprofit's in a good position to buy and negotiate that price, and we're monetizing the asset and redeploying capital in the private sector all at the same time. And one of the things that is stopping those deals is how land transfer tax is calculated on that. So if we're buying the land for $1 million and putting on a $20 million building, you're going to pay land transfer tax on $21 million, and that additional amount is very problematic to those deals and can stop them in their tracks. So legislative change I would is we would apply the same rationale as the Development Charges Act and just exempt nonprofit development from land transfer tax where it is accompanied by a building contract. And if that is problematic, then I would just eliminate the land transfer tax on the unbuilt building. The rationale for that piece of legislation, I understand, but in this circumstance, we would be removing that. The second money piece that I would look at doing has to do with the way that the development charge exemption is run. As it is right now, there's very strict adherence to the letter of that legislation. So you must be a nonprofit. And it is so strict to the point that a nonprofit partnering with another nonprofit that puts forward that partnership as a developer does not qualify for the exemption because it's a partnership, not a nonprofit corporation that is the developer. So you can imagine that if you start adding in, I want to partner with a private developer and I want to bring to the table the development charge exemption, and I can demonstrate that I have the benefit of it, even that is out. So by doing that, we're actually taking off the table the possibility of using the development charge exemption to unlock a partnership with a for-profit entity. So I would look at making changes to do that. There's complexity there because you're going to ask the government to look more deeply into the relationship that is happening than is the case right now. Right now, it is just you're a nonprofit, you're a nonprofit. It doesn't even matter whether the nonprofit is entirely owned by the private developer. You're a nonprofit, you get the exemption. I'm thinking you need to look a little deeper so that you can allow the exemption to carry on even in the context of a partnership arrangement. So those are money pieces, and I'll come back later to talk about some systemic changes I think that could also be made. What do you think, guys?
I can go next to just a couple things. So is okay. Okay, yeah, I'll be quick with mine, Andrew. There are just 2 points here. So I think one I've already alluded to is leveraging the progress that we're making through the federal programs on the modern methods of construction. I'm seeing a lot across Canada in different ways that we're approaching building, period, in terms of the built forms and modular and prefabricated and 3D construction, all these things. We're deploying lots of different solutions across sites. Where it's becoming most successful is where entitlements and approvals in the pre-development stage, where municipalities can actually embrace those and bring them to the site without too much delay. And I think the province plays in a very important part in Ontario in how we can actually deliver those solutions to site, because that's really where that's where we have to get. And if we want to build quick and most efficiently and take advantage of the technology that we have at our fingertips to leverage. Kind of related to that is off-site construction. I would identify the Personal Property Securities Act probably has to be looked at in terms of lending. I know that some banks have to face some questions as to how they finance these things. The PPSA allows them to take security interests on collateral, and it raises questions as to when something's off-site and being further developed to be to later brought to site. How does that affect their financing? Can they perfect a security interest before it's actually brought? And how does that certification process work? Because we're moving very quickly in the technological aspect of project delivery. Our private lenders especially have to get comfortable with how they lend to projects, and that's creating a lot of questions that I think that the PPSA may have to have some review and how to support that the best in order to meet the government's objectives. And I think the last piece that I would make, and I think John's he's reserved to get back to it on the financing piece. We don't necessarily need to see a lot of cash outflows. I mean, it's great if we could see cash going directly to sites and seeing it into the projects, but the province also has at its option to provide guarantees. And as we scale up for projects and as we're kind of putting unique partnership structures together, and quite frankly, the projects are just getting bigger. If we look at the space of social infrastructure, we see a lot of benefit in guarantees where not necessarily money has to go out, but it's allocated to support a guarantee. And if you have a footed constructor with a good balance sheet and you have a good project team and they can execute, you can really raise some favorable financing for projects outside of the normal boxes if you have some sort of covenant from the government in the form of a guarantee. John, perhaps you want to build on that when you get to your answer on the financing, but those are my 3 points that I'd bring to this discussion today. Andrew.
And again, and yeah, and again, Emmy, I'll jump into the fact that I'm more stuck on the system pieces, right? So I think I'm of the mind that things will get built how they want to get built. I think when we started this whole rapid housing initiative and things that were talking about supply, it was happening. And then what was happening in the market was that the private market realized that nobody was buying stock. And so now there's been this shift to purpose-built rental and making sure that people can just get housed, which is fine. So I think developing has to happen, and I agree with Nick and the fact that there should be these modern methods and rapid methods of getting these things up. My thing is the system is still saying that whatever's happening in the community housing space, the deck is pretty much stacked with the tenant base because we have a more complex need tenant and we don't have those revenue incomes to ensure that we can pay for some of these units being built. So when we think about it, again, a lot of our partners now that are getting into the development game aren't bringing on units that are specific to deep affordability or supportive. They're bringing on things that are trying to help with balancing their operations. So these are the 80% to market or the BMR stuff, where below market stuff, where they can start pumping stuff back into their capital, back into their operating reserve, so they can actually start being businesses. So I think when I look at the systemic changes that have to happen, there's got to be an integration between community social services, health, and housing at the government level to ensure that the money that's flowing or that's being funneled down gets integrated and better spent, so that I'll call it that bottom tier of what's happening at community housing, which is a very complicated and delicate tier, can be supported and served, so that when you're moving up tier towards that middle of the market or that median income piece, you can start getting more people to come in, feel like community housing is an attractive option for the middle class. So I think there's a split there. We deliver it all, but I think the fact that we are very bogged down at the one layer of what we do, it makes it hard for us to operate, and quite frankly, it makes it hard for cash to flow for us to get into the game with these types of initiatives. So I think more for me, it's the systems that I'd love to see repaired and integrated at the provincial level, because I do think the ministry that we're governed under is housing and municipal affairs. I would love that to be somehow integrated with housing and social services or housing and health in some unique way, because I think those are the things that we deal with on a daily basis as the challenges to how we operate, and that are the challenges to help us that are holding us back from getting to finding the dollars to get into the development game and building more supply.
So I want to pick up on one of Nick's comments there, in which he was brave enough to talk about the PPSA on a podcast. So one of the opportunities that is really before us in the sector now is that this is not a legislative change. I'm going to come back to more legislative changes in a second, but is both the provincial and the federal interveners. So Build Canada Homes, for example, can extract from its transactional experience as it builds changes that ought to be made and start to make those things clear. And in the meantime, it has more leverage than the average nonprofit to make systemic changes in how construction is delivered. So I think it is a fair statement to say that while there are modern methods of construction, modern methods of securing the money that's needed haven't really kept pace. So when we talk to a lender about a construction loan, the lender is still thinking they're going to secure a mortgage and only advance against things that are already stuck in the ground. That is not how modern methods of construction work. So as BCH goes through that process and they start to develop the contracts that make that happen, I think that should go open source, and they should be investing in that. And that goes right through the bonding and all the things you need in order to make this stuff go. So there is an opportunity to make it much easier for a nonprofit to develop, because instead of starting from wherever they were the last time they happened to do a building, they're starting from the experience of BCH and the contracts that they've already done, and they're placed in a better position that way. So there is real room for using that kind of leverage to create a system of delivery which is easier to access for a nonprofit who is not in the development game regularly. With respect to the structure of the sector itself, I don't know this number. Andrew probably knows this number off the top of his head, but there are a lot of nonprofits in Ontario. How many nonprofits in Ontario, Andrew? Do you know your membership?
Last check, 900, just under 1,000.
A lot. And one of the things that which would help us in terms of delivering more units is to have fewer, where we have fewer, more active nonprofits with a stronger balance sheets and stronger income streams and all that kind of stuff. To do that, they need to come together. It is difficult at the very best of circumstances for nonprofits to amalgamate or consolidate in whatever way they choose to do it. But when they have the idea to do that and they call guys like me up and I start explaining the process, it is not an easy go. And so changing the legislation so that it is easier to amalgamate, which can be as simple as ensuring that the approval system for lenders who are already have security against assets which are being amalgamated have a single form which they agree to and we pass on. It eliminates a whole bunch of fee and cost and time. Or that, well, this is a federal thing. A lot of stress happens where you have a charity, a nonprofit that's a charity, amalgamating with a nonprofit that is not a charity. And in my mind, the rule should simply be if the amalgamated corporation has the same objects as the charity, it's a charity. That doesn't mean you can't get in trouble by doing the wrong thing and issuing bad receipts. But it does mean that the 8-month wait of figuring out whether you've messed up your charity by having the amalgamation is removed from the cost of doing business, and you don't pay a guy like me to issue a memo to you which says, at the end of the day, I don't really know how this is going to work out, but it should be okay. And that's the current state of affairs. So providing some certainty in how amalgamations happen would be a very positive thing, and allowing them to make it, because you're just removing barriers and the costs of making a transaction, which we want to see happen. Another thing that I would like to see is changes for nonprofits to control affordability, governments to control affordability going forward. Whenever there's a program, in, for instance, a land trust, where they are acquiring units and then wanting to rent it out to somebody else on a ground lease and so on, say, well, how do I control affordability long term? And there is no really easy mechanism for doing that under Ontario law. There is different mechanisms that we end up using by layering them one on top of the other, which makes it fairly complicated at the end of the day. But what that means, Entitles Act to allow for an affordability covenant, changing the Perpetuities Act to allow options to survive 20 years. All those things are mechanisms that are used by nonprofits today to hold on, but they all have flaws. So eliminating those flaws would be important. Now, I know that there is zero politics in talking publicly about the Perpetuities Act, and it's way better to stand in front of a bill that's being done. However, if on top of that fireworks stuff, we start to remedy some of these systemic things which hold people back from being able to do stuff, we will make a change which allows for an easier transition and easier creation of affordable units in Ontario. So those are real changes which you could conceivably make to legislation, which the government could conceivably make legislation, which would help the process. And the last ones I've meant are zero cost changes. Oh, Andrew's looking up. If you're listening, you don't see him looking up. You have a thought about that, my friend. Okay. Right, Nick. What do you think?
I'm sorry. Was there? You cut out on me there, John. You're just kind of.
I didn't hear the end part. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Wait, I didn't hear the conclusion there. I was just enthralled with what you're getting through there.
No, well, the end part was those are zero cost changes that can be made. There's no hit on the treasury of any of that stuff, and it allows it removes barriers from doing transactions, which I think we all agree are in the scheme of housing in Ontario.
Agreed. And I think it goes to the general point that I mean, for our projects, when we work with nonprofits, the biggest burden that they have is delay and getting to shovel in the ground. And anything that is regulatory, transactional, somehow prohibitive, that creates time and schedule, or it creates uncertainty, it's usually it's almost in all cases at the cost of the nonprofit who's trying to develop, that historically hasn't been developing a war chest to get into that type of equity and that risk profile. So I think that we, and I was talking about how the National Housing Strategy is coming to its tail end, which has invested a lot in nonprofit housing development, and we have a lot of lessons to learn. So I think that it's a good opportunity when we look at what's next to share lessons learned where whatever those obstacles would be for nonprofits developing their own housing, to express what kind of transactional and development obstacles they've had because of legislation. And I think there's a lot to draw from what you said, and just from the project experience. Ludor is self-developing, and Andrew, oversees a lot of nonprofits that are self-developing. It's time to take inventory and figure out where because those are direct costs to the nonprofits who have been developing their own community developments.
Exactly. And
agreed. Timeline delays are a second. Go ahead, John.
So there is a provincial intervener as well in Building Ontario Fund, who has an affordable housing roundtable, who could be made aware, for example, of these constraints on moving forward for nonprofits, and particularly if they are experiencing that in their own transactions. Both Build Canada Homes and Building Ontario Fund access to in a way that we may not, and so there is a really great opportunity here for, I liked the word you used, taking inventory of the things which have held people back, and asking the Minister of Housing to next legislation.
Are there any points that you don't agree with each other on? I heard some different pieces around the financing and what might have to be true to actually continue to advance the agenda of non-market housing, and they all seem to make sense at different levels. We need more funding. We can use guarantees to advance non-market housing. And then Andrew, you were bringing up the reality of, to serve all populations, including those who are farthest removed from the housing market, we will likely need to be considering some type of rent supplements or tax credits or something to that effect. Did I capture those right? And does anyone want to weigh in further on that work? I mean, I do think if we think of it as a nation and how we want to solve for some of these challenges, that it might be an opportunity to think even broader than just the Ontario legislation.
Well, for me, I think the evidence of the housing crisis is what we see. We are seeing the increase. Homelessness is the evidence, and it's been there for a long time. But this growth in homelessness over the last, I feel like it's been the last 5 years. I know some of you will tell me it's been way longer, but I think there's been this exponential jump. Until we can solve some of those things, and whatever we're doing, talking about build and speed and everything else, it kind of doesn't matter. So I think for me, that's why I'm still stuck on the systemic bits, where how do we ensure that whatever gets built, people get put into, right? I work in the core of downtown Toronto. I see a lot of half-baked developments that are hopefully switching to things that can start putting people in homes. And that's, I think, the biggest thing is that at a national scale, we won't feel like this housing crisis has been averted until we see a significant reduction in homelessness and people actually contributing to the economy beyond trying to, cobble up enough money on a biweekly basis to pay rent. So I think those are the big things that we need to look at as the beacons. And that's why I say for our sector, a lot of it comes down to the structure of how we're operating and how we are funded to operate, because there's got to be some funding intervention. But I think we're good on trying to become more self-sufficient, because I've seen that over the last decade as well. So I think we need that, whatever we're doing on our own, when it's coming to building those structures that are bringing in revenues for these organizations. At the bottom level, when we're looking at the complexity of organizations, there's got to be some funding reform to ensure that the breadth of the population is covered, and we can continue to move in a self-sustainable way with less reliance on government. So that's where my head is at. Sorry, John, you were about to jump in earlier.
Yeah, I mean, there are some areas of disagreement out there, and for example, I have heard people talk about how we must lined up before we go and build. So if we don't have state because we're not actually helping the people who need to be helped, and therefore not achieving the outcomes we really need to achieve. And I understand the frustration associated with that. My own view is you do exactly what you can do under a particular set of regimes. We do have different governments across Canada, and within a province like Ontario, there will be changes in regimes and all that kind of stuff over time. And I think the sector should be taking advantage of whatever it can out of whatever government is in place. So if that means you build today and you're at a 70-30 split of market to non-market, and in the future another government offers more supportive and the nonprofit sector can switch that to 50-50, then that's what you do. So I'm not in the sit and wait category, but there are those who do think that that's the case. And another spot where there's some debate, I think, is on the appropriate role of the for-profit sector within, as a developer within this space, and that there is even the for-profit sector sometimes it can be contradictory in how they talk about this. I was at a session. I'm not going to name names because he's not here to defend himself, but fellow leader of a big for-profit entity starts his speech by saying he accepts responsibility for financializing housing assets, and that's why he's left with a whole bunch of single studios, which he's having difficulty moving and so on, but then also goes on to remind us that development is a return on investment driven business, and that capital, which is the lifeblood of development, is agnostic and looks for return. And so marrying that in a regulated environment with what you're attempting to achieve in terms of the creation of more below market housing. If you pick, for instance, the CHRA target of moving us from, what are we now, 4.5% nonprofit to 20, that's a huge target, right? So that 4.5% represents about 600,000 units. So saying we're going to, what would that mean? Quintuple that is a huge ask over the course of a fairly long period of time. And so there will be debate as to whether or not that's a realistic target.
So can I just jump in, John? I'm jumping in, but because
go ahead. That's what we learned.
I wish I just had the note, but I was working with my GR team yesterday, and there is a study that 17% of people in the province need this type of housing, like what we're calling affordable housing within the purview of what community housing and nonprofits provide. So that number from 5 to 20 is sounding more like it's what the need is out there versus some aspirational jump, right? So I know it sounds like it could be difficult, and I totally agree with you, John. Like, I hope that I didn't come across to say that let's line up all the ducks and go. I want to leverage whatever's happening stuff, but I never want to be in a operationally where we can't sustain up in the air. So again, I think the need is becoming more evident to this aspirational wish a few years ago from going from 5% to 20%, because I don't think people were equating it to the fact that it's just general affordability for the middle class, and they need clean, decent spaces to live in. So it's not number was a number, but I just wanted to jump in there, John. Like, there's a study as of last week that says there's about 70% of people in this core need in Ontario.
Right.
And that's like a percentage that we're seeing at, like, as kind of a standard for success, not just in Canada, but it's kind of across the board that 20, 21, 25, like it's all hovering around there. And that's where too, I think the point of my question is, how do we begin with the end in mind? Like, when we're changing up legislation now, and when we're thinking about delivering non-market housing at scale, have we, even though we won't, come through the gates with changing the whole market to like a 20 or 25% overnight, how are we going to intentionally move the needle there very quickly? Because I'll build on another point that was said, and that without capturing that in our minds at the start, I think the financing won't make sense eventually, if that makes sense, because there'll still be that target of how do we serve, because even now without a requirement, when we have well-meaning leaders in place that require developments to set aside a certain amount of affordable units, for example, what I'm seeing, and you guys would be able to tell what's actually happening across Ontario, but what we've seen in our areas is that sometimes developers have saved, let's say, 10% of their building to work with a nonprofit on affordable housing. What those units, in fact, are the ones that didn't sell on the private market. So they're often sometimes the bigger, more expensive units with high fees to maintain that don't make sense for people removed from the housing market. And so that's where I'm kind of interested to see, like, as we build it, where is that incorporated into our thinking?
I'm just going to jump in because I wanted to refer to one of John's points and answer this and let it flow through. I think for our sector too, we got to get our head around what we're bringing online. I think we were always trying to do the greater good of the greatest good. I know there are some organizations within my membership that are 100% working off rent-given income units or some kind of rent subsidized units. That can't work in the future when you're building buildings. So to your point, John, what we're bringing online has got to change, because I think it's got to work in reverse of what we've always done in the community housing sector, which is we got to get closer to that bringing in revenue line of what we bring online, and then over time work back towards the greater good. So I've seen a lot of the partners or a lot of the members in our space where anything they're bringing online is even a higher ratio. You said 70-30, John. Like some people are even bringing in like 80-20 or whatever they can do, and they're still affordable, so they're still below market because of the mandate. But they need that to ensure that they can, again, pay through the development, make sure they get through, and make sure they get long-term income so they think they can run the business. And then I think to your point, if legislation changes where there's more operating dollars for supports, then over time you can ratchet down the dial and make sure that you have a more balanced portfolio. But for right now, I think what's coming online, it's got to come online in a different way from what community housing providers are used to bringing on, and what our I guess our core mission is around helping people in the greatest need. I think that's going to start kind of changing because of the model in which we're working with in order to bring in revenue to sustain operations. So sorry, John, I know you wanted to say something.
I let Nick come in if you want. Nick, do you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, I would think just to bring this into the development and the construction space, what we're finding where there's room to grow and understanding how to integrate nonprofits into non-market housing, if government is in fact in the business of building housing, is how to integrate the operators into the design build process. And I think it goes a long way to consider your points, Andrew, because we're in a position now in developing and designing and ultimately building larger assets where the operator hasn't been identified yet. And there's huge operational kind of assumptions being made in creating the design, and I see risk in that, because typically, if you look at social infrastructure projects, you're going to be, if you're building a hospital, you have the operator of the hospital from day one designing that building, and then they are informed of their operational requirements financially and programmatically. And I think I wouldn't call it a disagreement, but I think there's room for to sort that out, to see how, if we're truly building non-market housing, how are we integrating, especially for these larger assets and these more ambitious programs, how are you integrating nonprofits properly so they can financially prepare and staff and take on that project. And I think that's a room for discussion in itself.
Yeah. So you asked Emmy about how to change legislation to drive all of that. And the answer is the individual legislative changes don't actually result in a specific result. But when we think about the things that we're talking about, if you want to have more non-profit ownership, then some of the assets that are built into some of the value that is stuck inside nonprofit assets today has to be liberated. And that happens only through amalgamation or different kind of boardships. I think Nick talked about the nature of sort of governance. Not every nonprofit is doing a development regularly. And as a result, you've got boards that are tremendously knowledgeable in the impacts of poverty on their population, and on how their populations are happy and what they need. But are they going to say, hey, that soft cost assumption Nick is bringing to the table is a little too low in my experience? Of course they're not going to be able to do that. So all of those things still have to come together to make it happen. So changing some of the way the pipeline works through legislative change is a way that legislation can happen. And the government has been, like I talk very favorably about how the government has changed legislation. By and large, they're changing legislation that does not require much hit on the Treasury. And if we continue down that path, the things I've mentioned that lead to the goals we're looking for don't require a lot of money, but they don't in and of themselves. The fact that you remove a barrier to organizations amalgamating doesn't change the fact that two EDs might not want to amalgamate. So, there is still a larger question, which is, if the nonprofit sector believes as a general principle that is a good idea, are we willing to be more aggressive in doing that? And for the private sector, there's been a lot of, I shouldn't say the private sector, because private nonprofits are part of the private sector too. But for the for-profit sector, that comment I made before, all those three things that fellow said were true, right? The result of following the money had been smaller rooms, which are now problematic in current circumstances, but it hasn't changed the basic underlying fact. And I don't think it should. That is the nature of development, which has driven a tremendous amount of wonderful development. And the inclusion of nonprofit in that is an important element. But when at the end of the day, you are financing that one way or another. What we've talked about doesn't change any of that calculation. And so there is an element of this, which when we have set the table properly legislatively, we are letting the ambition of the nonprofit sector and the ambition of the development sector to build a better Ontario take over to a certain extent. And in the past, until the particular storm and perfect storm of the last number of years, there's not a lot of doubt in my mind that both sides of that equation are willing to move forward and take chances and take risks to make that happen. So there is room for legislative change, but it also requires the same commitment to development in the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector. And if we could come to agreement that we need to increase the number of nonprofit units, which is not necessarily, you could see it not necessarily being in the best interest of a rental provider that is private to be increasing the number of units where profit is not the primary motivation. But if you agree to that as a larger piece, you could see how you can come together to move forward together. I feel like I rambled there a little bit. I hope my last point was crisp enough.
Any more words of wisdom before we wrap up the show? I know we're at time, and I thank you all for being here and sharing your wisdom and expertise. Really do appreciate the conversation. Anything else anyone wants to add quickly before we're done?
Oh, Emmy, I've talked a lot, but thank you so much for hosting us.
Thank you very much, Emmy.
Always a pleasure, and what a great conversation. Thank you. So today's episode featured a panel conversation with John Fox. Bye, Andrew. Thank you. Bye, guys. 3 leaders working across housing development sector leadership in Ontario. The discussion explored whether recent provincial housing legislation has truly enabled the delivery of nonprofit and community housing, and what policy changes may be needed if the next housing bill were designed specifically to scale below market housing. From land access and financing tools to regulatory barriers and bold policy ideas, the conversation highlights the structural shifts required to ensure that future housing legislation delivers not just more homes, but the right kind of homes for communities across Ontario. Thank you for listening to On the Way Home, a podcast brought to you by Blue Door.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.